Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our third lesson in our new Flex God Looks at the Heart series. Hi, I'm Gabriel, and this is Janelle, my wife, and tonight we have two new guests that you guys haven't seen yet since we've started. We're going to be having Hayden Colvin and Maria Leos with us excuse me, this evening, and we're going to be discussing the topic of our lesson tonight, which is the heart of a servant, which is, there we go, the heart of a servant. That's our lesson for tonight. But before we get to that, we got a couple of announcements we want to get through, and then we'll kind of get started with the lesson part. So first and foremost, everybody that came to the park on Sunday, thanks for coming. We had a huge turnout, and I feel like we were fairly responsible with distancing and all that stuff as best as we could, considering it was outside and everything, and we were playing like sports. But I thought everybody we had a good time, and it was a really great experience. So we're gonna do it again, but we're not gonna do it not this week. We're gonna do it the week after, and that's gonna be, because I'm going by the seat of my pants here, it's gonna be Sunday the 25th. Sunday the 25th, we're going to meet up at the park. And we're going to do a bit more structured with a little bit more stuff with it. We're actually going to have a cookout in addition to just playing sports. So you guys can come out, and we'll actually have like food for you and all that stuff too. So you don't have to worry about getting lunches. So just come ready to play whatever games you want to play. We're going to expand the amount of games that we have. It'll be more than just volleyball and basketball. I think we're going to have croquet, we're going to have cornhole, we're going to have a bunch of other things. So yeah, it's just going to be a great afternoon out, and hopefully by the 25th, we'll continue seeing cooling temperatures, so it'll be a really fun time for everybody. Again, if you're watching us, go ahead and post a comment on either through our Facebook or through our YouTube. Let us know that you're watching. In some cases, if you're watching through the 4Sixteen Facebook page, you're going to need to let StreamYard have access to your name so that we know who you are. Otherwise, it'll just say Facebook user, like this. That's how it'll show. So whoever said hello, thanks for watching and being part of it. You don't have to tell Facebook that if you're watching on YouTube. So there's that. But yeah, just let us know if you're watching, and you can always comment on the lesson or the discussion we're going to have later on as part of Bible Book Club. So, that's all the announcements I think we have right now, right? So that's all the announcements we have. Just that, yeah, on the 25th, we're going to do another park day after church services are done. And so if you're watching virtually at home or you're going to services on Sunday morning, either way, you're more than invited to come and be a part of that as part of 416. So let's get started. Again, the lesson tonight is called The Heart of a Servant, and we're going to be basing this out of 1 Samuel chapter 3. This entire series, this Flex God Looks at the Heart, is entirely out of 1 Samuel. So that's going to be our home base the entire time that we do this series. So 1 Samuel chapter 3 is where we're going to be kind of looking at today. And so I'm going to go ahead and start reading that. It's not very long. It's only 21 verses. So I'm going to read that for us, and then we're going to kind of get into it, yeah? So 1 Samuel chapter 3. Verse 1. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." But Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." So he went and lay down. Again, the Lord called Samuel. And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me." "My son," Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. A third time the Lord called Samuel. And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down. And if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other times, Samuel, Samuel. Then Samuel said, Speak, for your servant is listening. And the Lord said to Samuel, See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears about it tingle. At that time, I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family, from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons blasphemed God, and he failed to restrain them. Therefore, I swore to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering. Samuel lay down until morning, and then opened the doors of the house of the Lord. He was afraid to tell Eli the vision. But Eli called him and said, Samuel, my son. Samuel answered, Here I am. What was it he said to you? Eli asked. Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide from me anything he told you. So Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from him. Then Eli said, He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes. The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word. So there's a lot to unpack here in chapter 3. It's the first time that the Lord directly calls out to Samuel, right? And tells him something really, really important. And more importantly, something that he is going to then prophesy about. He's going to say, and he does later in that chapter, he tells Eli, well, the Lord said this about you, even though he was afraid to tell him. And we're going to talk a little bit about how sometimes the things that we hear from God are not necessarily things we want to hear. But it's certainly something that that Samuel had to begin to experience here in chapter 3. And it goes without saying, too, that Eli was also beginning to experience, Samuel being chosen to be this prophet for the first time. Like, as it says early in the chapter, that the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There were not many visions. So as far as Eli was concerned, this is a huge new development, because the Lord really wasn't speaking directly to people in those days, at least as much as the Israelites had been used to in the past. And so for Eli to recognize that, okay, well, this is actually God speaking to Samuel, it's going to be a really big deal. So our sort of verse we're kind of like focusing on is this verse specifically. 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 10, where it says, the Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other times. This is a different version. The Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other times, Samuel, Samuel. Then Samuel said, Speak, for your servant is listening. Because this lesson, yes, it's called the heart of a servant, but we all know how to serve. We all know how to do things for other people, right? What really the heart of a servant is really the heart of the listener. And that's kind of what we're going to be focusing on tonight. So we have this lesson was written by Glenn Newton. And so he tells a story here that I want to kind of share with everybody first. So he says, the first time I heard the late brother G.P. Holt, a beloved African-American preacher, preach, I was probably 7 years old. I vividly remember sitting with a coloring book in my lap as he was preaching. I was very focused on what it was coloring when I heard Brother Holt shout, "Are you listening?" The coloring book went down, and I began to listen as though he was talking directly to me. Sometimes even adults need to be asked, "Are you listening?" And this is where we're going here. Like, as adults, whoever is watching us tonight, and yes, Tanner, I can see the comments on the YouTube side of things, so you're good to go there. As adults, whoever's listening, whoever's watching, as young adults and as more grown adults, we have to be reminded at some point or another, are we listening? Because if we're being honest, we must admit that we're not that good at it. Are you good at listening?
Sometimes.
Yeah, but
like not all the time.
Ask me the question.
Are you good at listening?
No. I mean, I'd like to think that I am. I like to think that I've grown and matured to the point where I can listen very carefully, but I know I catch myself in times where I know I'm not listening, or I'm only listening to respond and not to listen to the other person actually tell me something important. So we have to admit that we're not that good at it when we think about it, because at the same time, though, like, it's kind of surprising because there really isn't much to the art of listening. You just sit there, you nod your head at the appropriate times, you just make sure that what they're saying is something that is actually entering your brain. But for many people, listening is a challenge, and you can buy. I mean, it's so much of a challenge that there's like a whole industry about teaching people how to listen. You can buy books, you can watch videos, you can go to conferences, you can go to seminars and things that they'll teach you how to be a good listener. And sometimes in like different like contexts, right? Be a good listener, like in your relationships, good listeners in business or at work or at school, whatever. There's plenty of things out there that purport to help people listen. And, the majority of the time that we've spent, like as ministers, even when we were like in Arlington, serving as missionaries, a lot of that time was spent listening, because we had to listen to our elders, we had to listen to our families, we had to listen to our teenagers. And a lot of time was spent just sort of listening to people. Sometimes they were like yelling and complaining and venting at us. Other times they were really sad and burdened. And other times they were just ecstatic. But a lot of time was spent just sitting there and listening and showing that empathy for what was going on. So all of that entire industry of listening exists because most people would rather talk than listen. And that's what I was saying before. Sometimes I catch myself listening only to respond. Listening only to respond, because what I want to do is get my point in, not necessarily listen to you. The metaphorical you, not you specifically. And there are other examples of places where there's just poor listening. Like, for instance, how many times have you caught yourself not really listening to like a sermon on Sunday morning? Like, what do we do? Like, what do we do to like avoid really paying attention to like a sermon or sitting through a class or something?
I mean, you can read the bulletin instead. You go to the bathroom. You can listen to a piece and then like make a comment.
Yeah, like whisper to each other. Yeah. The bathroom one is interesting because it's like, we can sit through like multiple hours of movies, right, without needing to go to the bathroom. Like, we sat through Avengers like Endgame, right, and it's like 3-hour movie. Didn't go to the bathroom once. But there are often times where it's like in the middle of like Terry's sermon or my dad's sermon or something. It's like, I gotta go pee. And so you get up and you go. And sometimes it's because you really do need to use the restroom. Other times it's because you need to just walk around because you're falling asleep. Or just need a drink of water or something. But like, you find ways to not listen to what's going on. We're just not that good at listening. We'd much rather be talking. We'd much rather be doing other things or dreaming about things or watching things. But listening can be difficult. So in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1, so again in chapter 3, in verse 1, we read that the word from the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were infrequent. And as I was saying before, it's such a big deal that the Lord is talking to Samuel because the Lord wasn't talking to very many people at that time. At least not directly. So why would God keep himself from his people? We need to look no further than Eli's own sons to realize that nobody really was listening to God at that time. People were too busy with their own lives and doing what pleased them to take the time to listen. And does that sound familiar to you?
Yeah, I think that's just something that has always been, but is magnified in these stories.
Yeah, and we talked about in our lesson on sin last week, we talked about Eli's sons and how they were just like fully corrupt individuals who were just doing all sorts of horrible things, in not just for themselves, but also in the Lord's house, in the temple. And so it was clear that they weren't paying attention to God, even though they knew things, even though they knew the scriptures, even though they had learned all the stories and everything that God had done for them. They weren't really listening to God in the present moment at that time. And so there weren't that many people doing that. And so, well, if the Lord isn't going to be heard, what else are we going to do? So let's tease this out a little bit more, right? So what does this have to do with servanthood? We know how to serve. We know how to do things for other people. We know that it is important for us to give of ourselves, to give of our time, give of our efforts, energies, and talents to do things for others. And ideally in the name of and in the service to God, right? So what constitutes a good servant? Well, a true servant listens for an opportunity. And it's really important that we understand that. A true servant listens for an opportunity. Because a true servant is not letting their talents go to waste. They're looking and listening, paying attention to everything that's available out there so that they can make sure that they can jump in and do the thing that they do best, which is serve. So the story of Samuel is obviously a lesson in listening, but it's also this lesson in servanthood. To put it plainly, one cannot be a true servant of God unless they listen to him. That is just requirement number one, because how are we supposed to know what we're going to do if we're not listening to the one giving the commands, right? A servant does not act on their own. A servant needs a master to guide them and to tell them what to do. And so God is our master in this scenario, and we need to listen to him. So it might seem like this sort of like duh kind of thing, but throughout the scripture, we see these people who were supposed to be God's servants and who plugged their ears to his words. And all the way back, Aaron, Samson, David, Jonah, Judas, among others. People's ears were so plugged up in Samuel's day that God's priests had turned the temple into a house of ill repute. And that's what we're talking about with Eli's sons. They were so far away, removed from what was correct in the eyes of the Lord and in what he was saying, that they ended up making the temple into a sham of itself. Mm-hmm. So why weren't they listening? Why wasn't God speaking louder? We still ask that one, don't we? We still ask that one. See, the problem is it's never the lack of volume in God's voice, because God is constantly telling us things. I mean, right? Mm-hmm. Like, what's the problem then?
We don't always like what he's saying.
We don't always like what he's saying, but I think even more fundamentally than that, we're just not paying attention.
Sure. Right?
So sometimes, yes, of course, there's going to be times where we hear something from God and it's just not going to be the thing that we want to hear or the thing that we want to do. But I would say that maybe more often than not, we're just not even paying attention in the first place. Because very simply, most of us don't expect God to speak. And we don't expect him to speak to us. I mean, why would he, right? Like, he's like the creator of the universe. He's like this all-powerful being. Why would he choose little old me, little old you to talk to? Right? There's a bit of humility in that, of course. But would we even know God's voice if we heard it? Would you?
I'd like to think so.
You'd like to think so, but Samuel didn't even know.
But Samuel didn't know, so.
But Samuel didn't even know. Samuel didn't know at all. In fact, he thought it was Eli. So either Eli sounds like God. And it's like, if, once we get the chance to hear God's voice for ourselves, we're gonna be like, oh, so that's what Eli sounds like. Or it was like muffled or something, then, and like Samuel was too asleep or something, and he didn't quite make the connection.
Well, we do know this is like the first time he had experienced God like that. So if any authoritative voice called out to me in the middle of the night, I would assume, oh, this is the voice I'm used to hearing, so it must be them. So
especially like as a kid, because Samuel was young still in this at this time. He's a kid, teenager, maybe upper teens around there. Like when you're at that point, like yeah, you're right. Any authoritative voice is like, I need to respond to that and find my nearest authority figure and ask them what they need from me, or why am I in trouble. But But of course, it's kind of the scene is kind of silly when you think about it. Like God keeps calling Samuel. Samuel keeps running to Eli. Eli tells him to go back to bed, and the cycle keeps going. Just going round and round. They were so unaccustomed to hearing from God that they didn't even recognize that it was him, because even Eli didn't recognize the first 2 times. He needed that 3rd time to finally get it, that it was actually God speaking to him. And even then, Samuel never recognized it for what it was until Eli told him. So how often do we really listen to the word of God, right? Not just read, but listen for what God is saying to us personally. I mean, it's really ironic that when people are drifting away from God, one of the most common complaints goes something like this: "But I pray all the time, and it just doesn't seem like God is listening." Actually, can you read that again?
Read that.
Yeah, that complaint, and read it in the most complainy voice.
"But I pray all the time, and it doesn't seem like God is listening."
The struggles, right? So remember, the problem is never the volume of God's voice. Are we listening? Are we paying attention? See, prayer is absolutely essential to the Christian walk, but prayer is not how God speaks to us. That's our way of talking to him, right? But that's not God's way of speaking to us. We must ask, yes, absolutely, but we must also seek and knock. Like the door says, or the song says, "Knock on the door. Knock and the door shall be opened unto you." Or Matthew chapter 7, verse 7. So isn't it interesting that both Eli and Samuel were very busy working in the temple, doing religious things? Yet verse 7 in 1 Samuel chapter 3 tells us that Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. How do you work, right? How do you work in the temple for years? Since you've been weaned, basically. You've lived in the temple. And the word of the Lord is not even revealed to Samuel yet. Like, it takes so many years. So that means that God really, the voice of God directly communicating with God, was like communicating with a stranger for Samuel. Because see, there is a difference between doing religious things and knowing God. Sometimes we become so caught up in church work that our relationship with God suffers. And so we stop listening because we're so caught up in doing a bunch of things, signing up for all the stuff, volunteering for all the things, taking care of all the people, that we're not listening to God ourselves. Any relationship suffers when one party stops listening. But when we finally learn to listen, we will find that God may have something life-changing for us to hear. After all, in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 10, the tail end of that, Samuel finally says, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." So, a true servant listens for an opportunity. A true servant also listens when spoken to. So from that moment on, God spoke to Samuel on a regular basis. From the those failed like rings where God is sort of calling him up and like goes to voicemail kind of. Those 3 times, or those first 2 times, and the third one Samuel finally gets it. From that moment on, God is speaking to Samuel constantly. Like that switch into prophethood turns on. And so all this stuff is coming in, and it's coming in hot. Because that first one was a doozy, right? Like this horrible thing is going to happen to Eli and his family. His sons are going to die. Like their sin is not going to be atoned by sacrifice. So they're going to be stuck with this, effectively a curse from God. That's heavy. But it also means that from that moment on, God is constantly speaking to Samuel and pouring out things into him. So through listening, he not only becomes a prophet respected by everyone in Israel, he gets to know God on a very deeply personal level. So when couples begin dating, they try to get to know one another. One way to do that is by talking. I know it seems like a sort of a weird left-hand turn, but bear with me. But if one person is talking, the other must be listening for communication to take place. That's the thing. Communication is talking and listening. It's both, not one or the other. So our relationship with God is often this one-way street. We talk to God expecting nothing in return, so we never listen. So, if a man proposes to his girlfriend saying, hey, Diane, will you marry me? And her name is Cheryl, then, whoa. A lot of things went wrong there. And one of them is that he wasn't listening because he clearly doesn't know who this woman is. And that's extreme, of course. But for us to know who God is, we must listen to him. So how does a Christian listen to God? Well, does he still speak audibly as he did in the days of the prophets in the Old Testament? No, of course not. Like we don't hear God's voice in our heads saying, hey, Samuel, Gabriel, Janelle, wake up, I have something important to tell you. That doesn't happen anymore. But and he may not appear in front of us like in a burning bush or something like that, but it doesn't mean that he is silent. So we have a couple of indicators and they're listed throughout Scripture that tell us how God continues to speak to us today. So in Romans chapter 10, verse 17, it tells us that he speaks through his word, so the Scriptures itself. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 19, he speaks through his people. Those faithful believers that do what he says speak on behalf of God too. In Acts chapter 17, verses 22 through 28, it says that he speaks through his creation, the things that he has built in the world for us to see and enjoy and even fear sometimes speak on his behalf. In Acts chapter 14, verse 16, he speaks through worship. And in Romans chapter 9, the first verse of chapter 9 tells us that he speaks through his spirit in our conscience, which sometimes, depending on how you listen to your conscience, might sound like someone saying, hey, stop it. He longs for us to know him. And so a good servant listens when spoken to. Are you listening? And so finally, a true servant listens even when the message is uncomfortable. And here we are, the point where we're talking about the things that God tells us that we don't really want to hear. The things that really just tug at the weaknesses that we have, the things that reveal us for who we truly are, and the things we just don't want to face. And often those are the reasons we stop listening, is because we stop liking what we hear. So the message Samuel received wasn't a pleasant one, as we discussed earlier. The family he had been living with for years, he'd been living longer with Eli and his family than he ever did as an infant with his mom and dad. And that family, that's become his family, was about to be subject to the wrath of God. So one can assume that maybe Hophni and Phinehas might have treated him like a brother, assuming they weren't absolute horrible people, at least interpersonally speaking. He could have, but either way, he would have considered them brothers. Samuel might have considered him like a father. So yet he listened to God's message without question. And when Eli asked him, tell me what the Lord told you, he didn't water it down. He didn't tamp it down. He didn't try to hide anything from Eli to make him feel better about it. So that's one thing we have to be ready for. If we're going to listen to God, he may not say exactly what we want to hear. His word may call for some real change in our lives, or it may possibly call us to stay right where we are. Don't we have experience with both of those? And I personally think that second one is harder than the first. Mm-hmm. Hearing about something you need to change, I think, is harder than hearing that you've got to stay where you are and actually not change anything.
Which one do you think is harder? Sorry, you've confused me.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's staying put and not changing something is harder than being told to change something. Yeah, it's rough. It's rough. because you kind of like lose the ability to do something. You lose that control that that we all crave, right? So, moving to the New Testament for a brief moment here, when the rich young man asked Jesus what he needed to inherit eternal life, he practiced really good listening. Like the young rich man was paying attention. He asked clarifying questions, right? But what Jesus said caused him to walk away in sorrow because it was an answer he didn't want to hear. And you can read that in Mark chapter 10, verses 17 through 22. The rich young man was a good listener, but he didn't want to face the facts, and he didn't want to face the change that he had to make in his life in order to gain the eternal life that was promised. So, a true servant listens even when the message is uncomfortable. And Samuel modeled that for us here in chapter 3, because he paid attention, he relayed the message accurately and without trying to soften the blow. So I'm going to make a quick reference here to a movie as we're sort of wrapping things down. I'm actually not a huge fan of this movie, but there is a scene and the dialogue that is actually really appropriate for what we're talking about tonight. So in 2007, there was a movie called I Am Legend, and Will Smith is our hero, and he thinks he is the only person left in the world that has not been infected by some viral thing that makes people act kind of like zombies. So it's one of those zombie movies where it's like a virus, not through like bites or like whatever. But anyway, it's one of those. It's not quite a typical horror movie, and there's sort of a twist at the end. But it's got a really interesting scene. So Will Smith plays this character called Neville. Neville finds out he's not alone at one point in the movie. And honestly, this isn't a spoiler, so, do with it what you will. It's from 2007, so if you haven't watched it yet, Neville finds out he's not alone when he comes across this woman named Anna and a boy, I think her son, right, named Ethan. Anna is on her way to Connecticut, where she is convinced there is a colony of survivors. When Neville asks her how she knows of this colony, she claims that God told her. And so Neville asks, "You can hear God?" And she answers, "The world is quieter now. We just have to listen. If we listen, we can hear God's plan." So there's an interesting parallel here from that movie to our times today. And certainly one that Glenn Newton, when he was writing this lesson, several years ago, couldn't have thought of either. We're also living in the middle of sort of weird times where there is a virus out there, a disease that is dangerous, that has also sort of stopped things. For several months, we were all under these lockdowns and quarantines and stuff, and the world was quieter. Were you listening? Did you take the time to actually pay attention to hear God's plan? Because that's probably as good a time as any, right? To practice effective listening. And even still today, we're not all back to normal, quote unquote. Things aren't as hustly and bustly as they were before. The world is still a little quieter than it used to be. So, have you been listening to God's plan? So during the time of Eli and his sons, it was not that God was silent. Because we even see him speaking in chapter 2, like before he even talks to Samuel. The problem was that his people weren't listening. Their world was too noisy. And if ancient scriptural world was too noisy, imagine how much noisy we are by comparison. If we want to know God and know his will, we have to pray, we have to worship, we have to read, we have to get godly counsel, but we must also get quiet. We have to block out the distractions so we can actually pay attention and listen to what God has to say. Jesus in Luke chapter 5, verse 16, even told his followers that when they pray, they should go into a closet so that they would be away from it and they could actually focus. And we see from his example that he often withdrew to quiet places. I'm sorry, Luke chapter 5, verse 16 is Jesus withdrawing to quiet places. An example of that anyway. Like even Jesus went away to tune out the noise. Why? Well, so he could hear. So are you listening? John chapter 10, verse 27 says, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." So that's our lesson tonight. That is the heart of a servant. So we are going to bring in our guests for tonight for the second half of our class, the Bible Book Club. And so I want to welcome Maria and Hayden.
Hello,
through the
people.
stream. Hey, guys. And I just want to start off by asking for like initial thoughts.
It was one that made me think where I am in my listening to God, especially when you were talking about the times that we're living now. For so long, we were trapped per se in our homes. For those of us who were blessed enough to continue to work, we went from work to home. But all that time we spent elsewhere when we were in a normal state. Now we had all this free time. And I did try to increase my Bible reading and studying, but I find it that I have a very hard time taking time to actually be still and be quiet and listen to God. That's hard for me because my mind is always going 100 miles per hour, thinking about, things I have to do, things that are happening with my family and friends. So I started meditating, and that is hard. I mean, I don't know who does it out there, but it's not an easy task. You have to train yourself and your brain to be on that calm state. And so for me, when I read through the lesson, like you asked Janelle, would I be able to listen and know that it's God speaking? Sometimes I feel like yes, 100%, but I'm pretty sure if I think back to my life, He's tried to speak to me and I didn't listen to what He was trying to say.
Yeah, that's really well said. Right?
Yeah, just kind of jumping off of that. No, I know especially the last few months, but just kind of like me in general, I can really relate to that there's been a lot of moments where kind of it's almost like an eerie quiet creeps in, and you're like, oh, this is like the moment where I'm supposed to be meditative or like contemplative or like kind of thinking thoughtfully or like this is the listening moment. And I know that I'm absolutely 100% guilty of just that's the moment that I don't want to sink into that, and so I'll like flip on music, I'll flip on Netflix, I'll flip on YouTube, whatever it is, like kind of diving into our current distractions, our modern day distractions, which I guess are a little bit different than the ones that they were dealing with in Samuel's day, but it's still just kind of like the worldly distractions kind of taking away. And I've been really bad about that recently, and a time where I probably shouldn't have been, and a time where I had a lot of time to not.
Yeah, definitely. So this is kind of a question that just popped into my head. I'm going to ask like all three of you guys. Are any of you guys the type of people that just like hate silence? That need to have like noise, like like Hayden said, just like putting on music, or like if you were like alone in your house, maybe like cleaning or whatever, you couldn't stand the quiet.
That's me.
Okay.
Yeah.
I actually love the quiet. I remember as a kid sometimes, like we were always home because I was homeschooled. So like I was always home. My siblings were always home.
Yeah.
And if we weren't home, we were all together somewhere else.
Yeah.
There were times where like I'd have a break in the day and I was small enough, I would just crawl under my bed and I would just like revel in the quiet and in the darkness. And even when people would come and like want something from me, siblings would come, Janelle, how are you? I just like not answer because I wanted to stay peaceful for a little while. So that's not really my problem, but I think what my problem is with listening to God is there's like points in my life where things happen. Doors are opened or doors are closed, and I feel like, okay, that's God saying that. And it's going to be like that, until the next big event. So instead of like listening for any changes or what I should be doing during that time, I'm just like, well, I'm going to do what I can or what I know to do. And then I'm just going to wait for the next big, obvious thing. And that doesn't mean I'm waiting like happily. I'm like, okay, God, like how long do you want me to be doing this? Because I'm going to keep doing it. But that's not the same as just waiting and listening and trusting. So,
yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about like last week when we did our lesson on sin, we actually spent a good amount of time on Eli specifically, because like his sons Hophni and Phinehas, they were just sinful and like not really redemptive. So like there's not much more to say other than those two were bad. But Eli is such a complex, to me, continues to be such a complex man, because he is, ostensibly this failure as a father for these two sons, but he's pretty successful as a father to Samuel. But he's also, fairly devout. Like he does the priestly duties. He does the stuff at the temple.
God still talked to him, and like God was still using him.
And God was still using him. So does it surprise you guys that it took Eli 2 tries before even he figured out that it was God speaking? Because it surprised me.
I don't think so. I think when you read from passages before the one we're studying specifically tonight, you saw the disconnection. Even though what God was still using Eli, there was a disconnection between him and God and everybody else, because when he brings up this on the first verse, it says that it was rare that God was now speaking in this way to people. There had been something broke between God and his people. And I think that might be one of the reasons why Eli didn't immediately, he wasn't aware that it was God who was talking to Samuel.
I think it's a weird transfer kind of God's trust in a person, if that makes sense. Like, yes, he was still talking to Eli, but it was to tell him like, this relationship, the way you know it, is coming to an end. Yeah. Because this is your family now, and I will choose somebody else. And I think Eli, maybe he wasn't expecting it to be that quick, or he just, he wasn't listening for that switch. He knew it was going to come eventually, but then when it did, he was like, oh, God's talking to you now, which means I need to listen to what he's saying through you, which means bad things are about to happen to me.
Yeah, I see a lot of like the chickens coming home to roost here between chapter 2 and chapter 3. Because like here's like from Eli's perspective, here's like this boy that enters his life, and he clearly has favor with God because he's been promised as a gift back to God from the woman that asked for him in the first place. And in chapter 2 in verse 22, it says, now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of the meeting, and so on and so on. And he starts to like rebuke them. But then in verse 26, it says, and the boy Samuel continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and with people. Like from Eli's perspective, here's this boy that comes in and he's just like skyrocketing in like favor and blessings and all this stuff. And I think you're right. It's like he is watching kind of in slow motion the disintegration of his relationship with his sons and his family's relationship with God, and all of this stuff is just falling apart before his very eyes. And it's too late. And it's too late. Even though right there in chapter 2, he's trying to do something about his sons. He's trying to to fix it as best as he could. It's too late. It's too far gone.
Right.
Something I will say for Eli though is like even with his failings at his worst, hearing things he doesn't want to hear, he does still listen and trust that those things are going to happen. So I think like he does provide a strong example there of somebody who does know God.
Yep.
And he knows that God is going to do exactly what he says.
And that's why I guess I'm still surprised that it took him 2 tries to realize it was God speaking to Samuel. Because by that point, he already knows like the train wreck that's coming, more or less. And it's just like, dude, come on.
And Nelly took the words out of my mouth. Stop doing that, sis. But because, you know, like she said, he wasn't talking to him now, but he was talking through Samuel. And like Gabby, like you mentioned in the lesson, you know, he has so many different ways to speak to us now, but are we even willing to listen? He still was willing to do that, to listen to what God has to say.
Yeah.
And so now in relation to us and our walk with Christ, are we willing to listen, whether it is, you know, like you said, you know, through his creation on a walk or through his word that is alive, and are we willing to listen? I think that's the main take out of this. You know, when you talked about what we were talking about last week, I'm like, oh, the heart of a servant. And then you sent me the lesson and it was completely different than what
really
I thought it was coming. Yes. And so
I read it. I read the lesson, and because I read it even before, like when we were teaching last week, I had already read it. And I was like, it's called Heart of a Servant, but it's really the heart of like a listener.
Yes.
It's about listening.
Exactly. But that's like you said, you know, it's such an important thing to do. If we don't listen, we don't know what God expects from us. And how can we serve if we don't know who we're serving? So it all ties together.
Yeah.
But I think that the way that the author of this lesson brought it to us is so, like the examples he brought and the scripture he brought, they just speak for themselves.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting too that the author was bringing up like some of the examples that he was giving of like Jonah, David, like people that are hearing the words, or like Aaron, you know, people that are hearing the words, the commands, but like, or Jonah, for instance, he hears, and it's because he hears that he just books it out of there. Like you can hear, but you're not exactly listening, you know?
Right.
So it's kind of, it's not even just that, like, you know, the rabbit ears on top of the TV are like wrong. It's everything there is working. The picture's coming in clear, and you're kind of afraid of the picture that shows up on the TV.
Yeah, and that's a really good point on Jonah. It's like, it's because he's listening and paying attention to God that he chooses to do the thing God doesn't want him to do. Like to like avoid that responsibility that he's been tasked with. Yeah, and I kind of want to hear a little bit more about that, because that struck me as really fascinating too. Again, like at the end of the lesson, the example of the rich young man who, I mean, he listened, he engaged, he asked questions, and yet at the end of the exchange, he leaves disappointed, sad, and I assume he never actually like complies with what Jesus is asking him to do. And how do we like get caught up doing that? Because I feel like I get caught up in that sometimes. I'd like to hear you guys' thoughts and expansion on that.
I think after you've served and you feel like you've done a lot of things for God, and you've done a lot of things for fellow Christians and church and all these things that you have, even though we shouldn't feel like we've earned it, we feel like we've earned it. Like, I am human and I've done all these things. What else can I do? And then when God tells you to get rid of that one thing, or to go to that one place, or listen to that one person who you feel like you shouldn't have to listen to, it's like, really? That's what you want me to do? It's too far, Lord. Like, that's just not going to happen. And I don't know, like, it's pride and entitlement on our part that we react that way. We feel like we get to a point of humility where it's enough for God. And then when he layers something on top of that, or he cuts a little deeper, depending on which way, it's just it breaks us a little bit.
Yeah.
We don't like being broken.
Yeah, for me, I think that a lot of the things, like, that I relate myself to the young rich man is when I pray for something and he answers my prayer, but not in the way that I was expecting or wanted to. It's very hard to humble myself and accept that that's what he's given me.
Right.
And it takes, like Nelly said, is about that humbleness. Because many times I feel like, wait, why are you denying me? I deserve it. But he knows better than I do. And it just takes time for me to adjust my thinking and my feelings so it actually matches what he has in store. And 100% of the time, it has always been for a greater blessing. I just couldn't see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's scary to take that when you do listen, when the picture kind of does come in, and when, at least for me, and then it's like, okay, now I need to make some sort of a change. That's like just like another big point of failure for me, is just making that initial action or doing that initial service and kind of seeing how things are going to play out. Like if any part of that journey I'm going to trip up, it's always like the first step. It's always starting to do something, and it's like a learning process, slowly becoming like more trusting and more willing to take those first steps, like knowing that they're going to lead to a better journey, even if I can't necessarily see where that's going to be right now.
Yeah, for sure. And then I've got two more things in the last 7-ish minutes that we have left in the class. The first one is, what do you guys think? What's harder, when God is telling you to change something or to challenge something about you, or when he's telling you not to do something, or to like not change it or stay still or stay put? Like for me, like I said, like the harder thing for me is being told to stay put, being told not to do anything. But I don't know. I wanted to hear that from you.
For me, it's change. I hate changing. I hate it with a passion. Even if it's for the better, if I have a hard time with that. I always have, and I probably always will. But yeah, when he tells me this change is coming or prepare yourself, that's hard for me.
Me, definitely change too. I feel like just as a person, I'm prideful, opinionated, sort of. And so when anything comes that kind of like shakes up my worldview, or, the person that I think that I'm supposed to be now, doesn't agree with the person that I really need to be, it's always really jarring every single time. So definitely change for me. If anything, I've been too stagnant with things. I need to change more.
Because you like the quiet,
and I do like the quiet, but staying put is harder. I like the quiet when I'm talking with God, when I feel at peace in the quiet.
Yeah.
If we're going, I feel like, I don't know. It's a weird combination, I guess, but like staying put's really hard for me, because I think I often feel like that means God's not using me, but I'm not where I want to be either. So it's like, well, if you don't want to be using me over here, but I'm still here and I don't like it and I don't feel like it's good for me, then where does that leave us? You know, like if he's called me to change something or to like go serve and do something, it's scary, but at least I know I'm being used. And like, if something is hard, it's like, that's just going to grow me in my spirituality. And maybe that's just like pride, like, oh, he's using me. And I may, in my, like, what I feel is suffering, which usually isn't really suffering. It's like, I might suffer a little bit, but like, look at all the blessings that come out of it. And I'll be able to like, look at the work I'm doing and I'll grow. But like, if I am just told to stay put, which is growth in and of itself, but it's different because I don't feel, it's like, well, I don't feel like I'm being used. I don't feel like I'm necessarily blessing others or being blessed. So I'm just stuck here.
I wonder if our sort of take on that is just because of our previous experience, like in ministry.
It probably is.
Because it's like when you're like a full-time minister and you're or missionary, and you're actually that's what you do for like your job and your livelihood, but it's also your worship and your service. And you're constantly having to change things, and you have to be ready to drop things and pick new things up, and like just try just try different things all the time. It just becomes like easier, I think, because it's like we have to have lots of practice in change, that I think having to be told to like no stay, hold on,
but
it might be a little harder for us anyway, and I think just based on that specifically for us,
and that's probably also has to do with the fact that like we feel like it's changing in that one spiritual area. We're not like changing a lifestyle.
True.
You know, like what I hear from Hayden is like there's stuff I need to like personally change a lot, and like Maria's like I just hate change because that means like my world is changing, and for me, I think it's like, well, if as long as like spiritual stuff is changing and like I'm called to do these things and it's like in this category, it's fine. But if I like outside of that am personally told like you need to be doing something different, even if that's staying put, I'm gonna mess up your question. Even if that's staying put, you're being told to do something and to change. And so I think just in general, when it's something that like cuts you deep and like the way you think you should be, the way you think the world should be, it is a lot harder than like actions and service to others.
That's fair. So our last bit, and this is actually more of a silly one. This is what Tanner said to our questions about Eli not listening to God or not being able to recognize God. He says, well, Eli was trying to sleep. He's tired. He's not thinking of God.
True. I mean, in all seriousness,
but in all seriousness,
I think we get tired and we stop thinking about God because it's like, I'm tired, Lord. Like I've done enough for now and I need a break.
It's scary to think if he gets tired of listening to us, though.
So thank you, Tanner, for posting that. And as always, anybody who's out there watching and you want to post a comment as we're having discussions and stuff, we'd love to hear from you as well. Well, but that, at least for tonight, that is all the time we have. Thank you both for being here with us tonight. Thank you, Maria.
Thanks for having us.
Hopefully we get to have you guys back for another one of these, because there's like 13 lessons in this, so we're gonna be doing this for a while. But yes, Maria and Hayden are gonna go away for now, but you guys stick around, don't leave. After we're done, I need to talk to you guys a little bit more. But yes, thank you both for being with us tonight, and we'll see you around. All right. Well, everybody, thank you so much for being with us, for watching, for commenting, for liking, subscribing, all the things. We've got another lesson next week. It's called The Heart of God. That's really early in the series, don't you think, to be talking about the heart of God? But it's going to be a good one. And we'll have a couple of new guests next week joining us here to discuss that as well. Just another reminder for those of you in 4Sixteen, excuse me, that the 24th of October, after service, we're going back to the park. And
24th or the 25th?
The 25th, good catch. The 25th of October, after service, around 1 o'clock-ish. We're going to be going back to the park, and we're just going to have a fun like field day, and we're going to have cookout and like sports and all those great things. So just we're going to be posting details about that very, very soon. Ideally, I think by Friday or so, we'll have something up that will let you guys know what the details are going to be about all of that. But thank you for watching. Thank you for joining us. Those are really great guest suggestions, Elizabeth. Elizabeth says that we should get J-Lo or Oscar the Grouch to be our guests. I love Oscar the Grouch, so like don't even joke. But thank you guys for watching so much. We love you, and we'll see you next week.